The darkest human experiments in history science has been one of the most powerful forces driving human progress. The medicines, vaccines, and treatments we rely on today are the result of decades of research and experimentation. But the history of scientific advancement isn't always something to be proud of. Some experiments, instead of protecting human life, ended up causing immense suffering. Especially during certain periods of the 20th century, researchers conducted studies that today are considered deeply disturbing and ethically unacceptable. In this video, we're going to explore several real human experiments from history that sparked major controversy. Some of these experiments were conducted without people's consent. Others targeted vulnerable groups who had little power to refuse, and many of them remained hidden from the public for years. The Willowbrook hepatitis experiments. In the 1950s, there was an institution in New York called the Willowbrook State School. It was a large facility where children with intellectual disabilities lived and received care. However, the conditions inside the institution were far from ideal. The facility was extremely overcrowded, hygiene standards were poor, and diseases spread rapidly among the children. One of the most common illnesses in the facility was hepatitis. Because the disease was already widespread at Willowbrook, some researchers saw an opportunity to study how it spread and whether immunity could be developed. So they began conducting experiments. As part of these studies, some children were intentionally exposed to the virus. In certain cases, weakened forms of the virus were given to them, while others were directly exposed to infected material. Researchers argued that the experiments were necessary to better understand the disease. But critics later pointed out that the children involved had no real ability to consent. In some cases, parents were allegedly told that their children would only be admitted to the institution if they agreed to participate in the research. The experiments continued for several years and did produce scientific data about hepatitis. However, once the details became public, the studies were heavily criticized and became one of the most controversial examples of unethical medical experimentation in history. Nutrition experiments on Indigenous children in Canada. During the 1940s, many Indigenous communities in Canada were suffering from serious health issues, particularly malnutrition. Researchers began studying these communities in order to understand the effects of poor nutrition on human health. However, some of the methods used during these studies later became highly controversial. Experiments were conducted in residential schools where Indigenous children lived. In some groups, children were given vitamin and mineral supplements. In others, these supplements were intentionally withheld so researchers could compare the outcomes. The goal was to observe how different levels of nutrition affected children's growth and development. But one of the most troubling aspects of these experiments was that certain basic health services were deliberately limited. For example, in some schools, dental care was postponed because researchers believed it could interfere with the results of the nutrition study. For many years, these experiments remained largely unknown to the public. The documents only surfaced decades later, when historians and researchers uncovered them. Their discovery sparked serious discussions about the treatment of Indigenous communities in Canada. Clinical trials after the Bhopal disaster. In 1984, one of the worst industrial disasters in history took place in the city of Bhopal, India. A toxic gas leak from a chemical plant exposed thousands of people to deadly chemicals. Thousands died within days, and hundreds of thousands suffered long-term health problems. In the aftermath of the disaster, hospitals and research centers were established to treat victims and study the effects of the exposure. However, years later it was revealed that some pharmaceutical companies had conducted clinical trials in the region. According to various reports, some patients were not fully informed about the nature of the medical studies they were participating in. Some individuals even claimed they didn't realize they were part of a clinical trial until much later. For people who had already suffered a massive tragedy, the idea that they were being used for experimental research sparked significant ethical concerns. The controversy highlighted the importance of transparency and informed consent in medical research. Experiments in San Quentin Prison. In the early 20th century, another controversial series of experiments took place inside San Quentin Prison in California. The prison's chief physician, Dr. Leo Stanley, believed that criminal behavior might have biological causes. According to Stanley, certain hormones or physical traits could influence whether someone was more likely to commit crimes. To test this theory, he began performing experimental procedures on inmates. Some prisoners underwent surgeries involving hormone glands. In some cases, tissues taken from executed prisoners were transplanted into other inmates. Stanley believed these procedures could potentially alter human behavior. However, many scientists later